In June 1919, Germany was forced to sign a peace treaty after its defeat in World War I. It was named the Treaty of Versailles. It formally ended the First World War between Germany and the Allied forces, and it held Germany fully and solely responsible for it, further subjecting it to harsh and crippling terms of peace. As a result, Germany lost about 13% of its territory and 1/10 of its population. Its armed forces were severely limited to only 100,000 troops, and Germany was required to pay reparations amounting to $33 billion. The Allies thought this treaty was necessary to discourage Germany from ever taking up arms against them. However, this turned out to be extremely humiliating to the German people and eventually led to the rise of the Nazi Party and the outbreak of the Second World War. Hitler understood the collective bitterness of the German nation, and he built his rhetoric around it. He promised to abolish the Treaty of Versailles, revive the German economy, and rebuild the military. But the mistakes he would later make would lead Germany and the world into ruin. Hitler's first and most damning mistake was declaring war on nearly every major power on Earth. Rather than isolate his enemies and take them on one at a time, he antagonized all of them until they turned against him. Upon becoming Chancellor in 1933, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, signaling a rejection of international diplomacy. Then in 1935, he reinstated conscription and started to rebuild the German army, both in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then in March 1936, Hitler marched German troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized buffer zone meant to protect France from German aggression. This was a direct challenge, yet France and Britain failed to act. As Hitler later admitted, the 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. Next, in 1938, Germany annexed Austria, despite Versailles explicitly forbidding any political union between the two. Later that year, at the Munich Conference, Britain and France allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in exchange for Germany's agreement not to make further attacks in Europe. But later, in 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway, making a bold claim to the land and shattering any illusion that Hitler wanted peace. Even so, no one opposed him then, and he was left with unchecked impunity. After that, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. This time, Britain and France had no choice but to declare war on Germany 2 days later. World War II had begun. From that moment on, Hitler's aggression expanded outward with breathtaking speed. He conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in less than 3 months. At the time, Hitler's strategy seemed to be the domination of all of Europe. But what he did next would be far more catastrophic to his campaign and ultimately united the whole world against him. In September 1940, Germany launched a series of air attacks on Great Britain, known as the Blitz, which sustained bombing key cities such as London for 8 months. By June 1941, Hitler launched an ill-timed attack on the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa, a campaign that would prove utterly disastrous to Germany as it was with Napoleon in our video covering his Russian invasion. During all this time, the USA had maintained neutrality and took no part in World War II. However, Hitler made another enormous mistake that would ultimately lose him the war. In December of 1941, Japan launched a surprise military attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Subsequently, with little deliberation or counsel, Hitler declared war on the United States, which was entirely unprovoked as the US had not declared war on Germany. This was a key turning point in the war as it awoke a sleeping giant. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler activated the world's largest industrial power and gave common cause for world leaders to unite against him, which ensured his eventual destruction in 1945. Hitler overstretched his military operations across the entire surface of the earth. His German army was fighting on too many fronts: in Europe, Asia, North Africa, and the Atlantic, which led to logistical nightmares that ultimately led to his downfall. During the war, the Allies continuously bombed German oil fields and plants, leading to massive shortages in petroleum and oil. Panzer divisions often ran out of fuel before battle even commenced. Luftwaffe operations were grounded because of a lack of aviation fuel. Trucks had to compete with tanks and planes due to diesel scarcity. In fact, the German army relied heavily on horses during the war, employing an estimated 2.75 million horses for various tasks such as reconnaissance, supply transport, and even cavalry units. And once the rains came in autumn, supply carts bogged down in the mud, and many horses froze to death or starved in the winter. This obviously crippled the Germans' mobility and gave the Allies a decisive edge over them. Furthermore, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they encountered major logistical difficulties. The vastness of the Soviet terrain stretched German supply lines beyond their limits. Roads were primitive, often turning into seas of mud during the rainy seasons, making movement painfully slow. Railway incompatibility added another layer of difficulty. Soviet trains ran on a different gauge than German ones, so the German troops had to manually dismantle and rebuild thousands of miles of track, delaying resupply efforts by weeks, sometimes months. Meanwhile, the Soviets sabotaged rail lines and bridges, compounding delays and isolating frontline units. To make matters worse, the German army had been sent in with the assumption that the campaign would end before the Russian winter. Most soldiers had no proper winter clothing or supplies. As temperatures plummeted below 30 degrees, engines froze, weapons jammed, and thousands of men died from hunger and disease. Throughout World War II, Hitler spread the German army too thin, leading to logistical failures which overextended its supply lines, exhausted manpower, and created vulnerable flanks. This ultimately contributed significantly to the downfall of the Third Reich. One of Adolf Hitler's biggest personal flaws, and one that cost him the war, was his deep paranoia and distrust of others. He didn't trust his generals, his advisors, or even his closest allies, even those with far more military experience. A clear example of this was during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Some of his commanders, like Field Marshal von Bock, advised him to focus all efforts on capturing Moscow, but Hitler split the army into three parts, one going north to Leningrad, one south to Ukraine, and one toward Moscow. This spread out approach meant they failed to take any of the key targets quickly. The worst example was the Battle of Stalingrad in August 1942. Initially, the Germans faced fierce Soviet resistance and brutal urban warfare, which slowed them down and drained their resources. After that, they were completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, and trapped in freezing winter conditions. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German 6th Army, asked Hitler to allow a retreat, but Hitler refused, ordering Paulus to hold the city at all costs and calling any withdrawal as an act of cowardice. Attempts to resupply the encircled troops by air failed miserably, providing only a fraction of what was needed. With no food, ammunition, or reinforcements, the German forces faced starvation and degradation. By February 2nd, 1943, Paulus surrendered his position. The entire 6th Army was destroyed and captured. Over 250,000 soldiers were lost. This defeat marked the first major catastrophic loss for Germany and was a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Another example of Hitler's paranoia is when he got rid of his generals who disagreed with him. Many top commanders like Guderian, Manstein, and Rundstedt were fired or ignored after offering advice that didn't match with Hitler's views. Over time, this left him surrounded by people who told him only what he wanted to hear. As the war dragged on, his paranoia got worse, leading him to isolate himself and become increasingly out of reach. For example, he spent most of his time in military bunkers and cut himself off from the outside world. His health got worse, and he began relying on drugs given to him by his personal doctor. These included stimulants, sedatives, and painkillers. He would stay awake until the late hours of the night, then sleep through most of the day, missing critical military developments. As a result, he couldn't make timely decisions that were important, and communication with him was far more difficult. His inner circle had to wait for hours just to speak to him, while the war situation kept getting worse. By 1945, Hitler was living in the Führer bunker in Berlin. He rarely left and barely met with his generals. Reports from that time describe him as angry, disconnected, and increasingly out of touch with reality. He ignored facts, blamed others for defeats, and refused to believe the war was lost. When Germany finally lost the war in May 1945, Hitler committed suicide along with his wife, Eva Braun. Hitler's antagonistic attitude, poor decision-making, and deep paranoia brought about his eventual destruction and Germany's defeat in World War II. What other mistakes do you think sealed his fate? And what practical lessons can we learn and apply today from these mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful videos on the mistakes that shaped our world. See you next time.